Removing Barriers is a four-part series that seeks to inform and inspire people of faith to understand the fight against racism with an historical perspective coupled with personal witness and experience. The guests share their insights into the very prejudice that has plagued the nation and the world. Your program host is Father Jim Korda, president of CTNY, the Catholic television network of Youngstown.
Hello and welcome to our show, Removing Barriers. I'm Father Jim Korda. With me is Bishop George Murry, who is the chairman of the Bishop's Ad Hoc Committee Against Racism. Welcome.
Thank you, Father.
You know, Bishop, when we talk about the sin of racism and also speaking out against it, why is action so important and necessary and not just being passive about it?
Well, I think you said it in terms of what you said at the end about being passive. If we don't speak out, if we don't take action, if our beliefs don't become concrete in our actions, then they simply remain very personal. I've had people say to me that they don't see themselves as being racist, and they probably don't. And I understand that. But when it goes to the next step about what are you doing, for example, in your community, or what are you doing in your neighborhood to combat racism, sometimes people will say, well, no, I don't get involved with that. The only way that we can prevent an evil from growing and expanding is by standing up to it. So we not only have to be verbally opposed to racism, we also, we also have to take action to diminish racism in our society and eventually eliminate it.
You know, some people say, well, I pray about it. I pray against racism and people who are prejudiced. Is prayer enough?
Well, first of all, we know that prayer is very, very powerful. But prayer should always lead us into further action, because we live in a world where there is negative action and negative force that's working against us. There's a great deal of effort in our world to promote the idea that one race is superior to another. As Christians, we have to counterbalance that and say we're standing with Christ, who sees every individual as created in the image and likeness of God.
You know, one of the words that we really haven't talked about in the show yet is discrimination. We've talked about prejudice, racism. What about this word of discrimination? What exactly does it mean, and who does it affect?
Well, it affects a wide variety of people. Discrimination is basically saying that an individual is not worthy of a particular value, a particular place. An individual is not worthy to live in a particular neighborhood. An individual is not worthy to go to a particular school, and so therefore that person is discriminated against. What discrimination does is eat away at the root of the value of that person. And it says that person is not worth as much as someone of another race. Discrimination is a form of prejudice. And prejudice is a form of racism, because we are saying to another person, because you were born in a particular race, certain things are not open to you. But that's not what we say in the documents of our country, and it is certainly not what we say in the gospel.
Why then are we so superior at times? Why are certain races have the feeling that they are more powerful? Why is that so much part of history and heritage?
I think it goes back to original sin. It's a sin which we have carried down through history. It's often said that history is written by the winners. So when you go back and read a history book and you hear about what happened in the 1800s, the losers are not the people who are writing the book. It's the people who won. And the winning, I think, can sometimes create this sense of We won because we were superior, not because we had better military tactics or because we outmaneuvered someone, but we are psychologically and sociologically and theologically superior to other people. People are going to disagree, and unfortunately, another effect of original sin is war. But what the church asks us to do, coming right from what Jesus asks us to do, is to treat every human being fairly and to treat every human being with respect. And if in our sense of superiority, we push other people aside and say, your life is not important, or your dreams are not important because you're not of our race, that's an example of racism.
Let's go back to that whole concept of power. You had mentioned in an earlier show that really power is the thing that drives a lot of the evils of racism and prejudice. How does one harness power and make it more a benefit to humanity than an obstacle?
Well, I think we've seen people throughout history who have taken power and used it for evil purposes. And we have also seen people throughout history who have seized power and used it for good. And it's, going back to something we said in an earlier program, it's an issue of evangelization. It's an issue of metanoia and change. The more we allow the gospel to be a part of our lives, to be a living experience in our lives, the more we want to be like the Lord, and we want to use power which has been given to us by God. We want to use that to advance the gospel rather than to put people down. Power, I think, is one of those human realities that can easily go either way. It can be constructive or it can be destructive. For us to choose the constructive, we need the grace of God.
In closing, what would you say about how important humanity is and how important human life is when we talk about respect and dignity, and in this whole sin against racism? Why is it so important to keep that as our focus?
Well, because I think that over time, we've lost a sense of the value of the human person, the individual person. And as a result, for example, we don't, in our society, we don't have a problem with taking the life of an unborn child, because we don't see that life, many people don't see that life as being valuable. The church says every human life is valuable from the moment of conception to the moment of natural death. That also means in between. Sometimes we get focused on conception and get focused on death, and we forget the in between. Every human life is valuable, and every human life reflects the divine. And that's what we have to keep reminding ourselves of, regardless of the way someone looks or what they or what language they speak. That life is valuable.
Thank you, Bishop. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
There's a lot of violence in the world right now.
I just see people shooting and car wrecks that sometimes were on purpose.
What do you think the power of God could do in our world?
Change some of the people's minds and how they act.
We need to love our neighbors and love our enemies.
And love each other. That's what I think.
We are in our 7th year at Cristo Rey Jesuit High School. It arose from the desire of the Jesuits in the Chicago province to serve the Hispanic community here in Chicago. One of the things that's unique about this school is that our kids work 5 days a month at offices in downtown Chicago to pay for their education. That idea originated here. We got telephone calls the first day from the companies thanking us for sending us those kids to their companies. The companies feel good about themselves. 95% of our kids are the first ones in their families to finish high school, and 87% of our graduates are in college right now. This project attracts wonderful, wonderful, enthusiastic, idealistic people. They have to have the desire to kind of reach for the stars. No one believed that it would be as successful as it is. Well, it's obviously caught on, and we're very, very excited about it.
Welcome back to our show. Joining me is Rev Dr Robin Woodbury. Welcome back.
Thank you.
And it's so wonderful that we're going to spend some time talking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Because if there's someone who epitomizes that whole sense of truth and justice and nonviolence, it's certainly Dr. King. You know, the two words that come to mind, though, sometimes when we go back to the history of that whole civil rights movement, is there was war between love and hate. Why do we continue that struggle with two emotions that are so much at odds? How do we bring them together into one?
That's, if we can answer that, wouldn't we solve all the world's problems, right? Well, you know, you have light, dark, you have good, you have evil. I mean, you have those things present, but getting people to understand their role in all of this could make a difference. It could make a difference, but you have to reach them, and sometimes they're so far gone in a different direction that it's often hard to bring them back to where they are respecting people, where they're not promoting hatred. And so it's a task at hand for sure, but we have to continue to put forth an effort in for sure.
You know, and I think as we look at Dr. King and his efforts, you know, there's perfect examples for us to follow. And I think that's the wonderful thing, not only about him, but about other leaders who have embraced, you know, truth and love and peace, how we need to embrace those same things, but how difficult it is sometimes for whatever reason. And sometimes I think before the taping we were talking about, we think we get to a certain point in our lives and then we find ourselves back at square one again, you know, kind of coming full circle, as you had mentioned. Why is it important for us to keep moving ahead and not taking those steps back and not repeating kind of those terrible things of our history?
Because they don't benefit us. They don't benefit us at all. So we have to keep pushing ahead. And even when Dr. King was using the nonviolent means of addressing issues, there were people who felt that wasn't the answer. Beat them up, shoot them all, kill them all. You know, they felt that fighting was the answer. But it takes a stronger person to not hit back than it does for somebody to just unleash. And so he embraced the nonviolent way because he believed that would produce better results than just fighting back. And so, yeah, we find ourselves kind of looking at a lot of the same things that they were looking at right in the heat of the civil rights movement. But we have to continue the fight, not necessarily with our fists, but by doing the right things and setting forth the right mindset in place for people.
When we talk about Dr. King, what in your mind would be his greatest legacy? And what in your mind would be something that we all need to embrace and to never let go of?
One of his greatest legacies, obviously, for me, was just reaching across lines to people. He didn't fight that fight by himself. He didn't fight it with just black people. He fought it with anybody who understood that there was a way to treat people and there was a way not to treat people. And so whoever was willing to link arms with him, he was willing to do that, which was, I think, a very unusual thing for a Black Baptist pastor because, you know, reaching across different denominational lines and even faith lines, because he had some rabbis that he worked with, was not a very acceptable means of work. And so he was willing to look past all of that. And that says, to me, that says a lot. That says a lot. And it, I would hope, would say a lot to others who are on the front lines of fighting for rights of people, social justice issues and all of that. Just be able to work with those who want to see something good happen.
When I was doing a little research, One thing that really came to mind was his letter from Birmingham jail.
Oh, yes.
And there was a quote there. He says, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. How can we embrace something like that and see the many injustices that surround our world and our communities, not just racism, but many injustices?
We have to be willing to take a step back and see it. Oftentimes we don't see it because we're immersed so much in it or surrounded by it, or we've gotten used to it. But when people speak, we need to be willing to take a step back and listen. And people are speaking, you know, and instead of listening, we're arguing about what they're saying. And so listen, because what they're saying has value.
There's an interesting thing in an exercise that some Catholics do in marriage encounter. It's called a 10 and 10. They talk for 10 minutes and their spouse listens, and then that person talks for 10 minutes and that other person listens. And how important it is, as you mentioned, for us to listen. There's always a time to speak.
That's right.
But there's a time to listen
That's
as well.
right.
You know, I think of Ecclesiastes, that wonderful book. There's a time for everything under the heavens.
Right.
And how important it is for us, especially as people of faith, people of truth and justice, that we need to embrace that.
Absolutely.
In our last few minutes, what would you like to share with the folks that are with us, primarily about Dr. King?
Well, I was 3 when he was assassinated. However, my parents were very active in the civil rights movement, and so growing up, they continued to teach us how to respect people, how to stand up for things that we see that are not right, and they laid that foundation and principle in our life. And so growing up, I knew about Dr. King because my parents made sure that I did. And so his principles have helped me learn how to respect people who are different from me, learn how to stand up for what's not right, speak out against it, but do it in a way that doesn't promote more ills and violence or more issues, but do it in a way that gets people's attention, but then allows us to kind of come together so that we can start working together to resolve whatever problems we have.
Well, Reverend Woodbury, thank you so much for helping us see Dr. King and also his legacy, and continuing to embrace that and lift that up as people of faith, but also as people who seek justice in a world that continues to be racist.
Yes.
Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.
There's a lot of violence in the world right now.
I just see people shooting and car wrecks that sometimes were on purpose.
What do you think the power of God could do in our world?
Change some of the people's minds and how they act.
We need to love our neighbors and love our enemies.
And love each other. That's what I think.
My name is Sister Murry Claudina, and I run a home for abandoned children. I want to take care of children who have no parents, because luckily I come from a very loving family. There are 8 of us. And I remember when one of my cousins got sick, and she called my mom and said, "Mom, the doctor has said that I might not have too long to live. Will you please raise my 3 children for me?" I remember we had a meeting at home, and my dad called a meeting, and my mom was explaining to all of us. And my father said, you know, this powerful word, he said, "We already have 8. What is 3 more?" We learn to care for each other, to love each other, to fight among each other, to make up, to forgive, to just to be a family. And I think that's what I learned from home, and I wanted to share that with children who do not have that love and that opportunity just to know what a family is all about.
33 million Americans have descended into poverty. And as their futures fall, so does our nation's.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Leigh Greene. Welcome to our show.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm excited to be here.
You know, in our previous segment, we were talking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he certainly taught us how important it was to speak out against injustices.
Yes.
And I think when we look at the sin of racism, and I call it a sin, I think we kind of question in ourselves, like, am I a racist or am I prejudiced? And so could we kind of begin with answering the question, like, who is racist? Are we all considered that, or is that just something that's part of the atmosphere or part of what's going on in our world?
The term that I would probably like to use first is bias. So we all have biases. I'm biased against certain things. I care not to participate in certain events or just be part of certain activities. Prejudice, I think, comes from an understanding of, I don't like it. I might have a reason why I don't like something. I might not even have a reason why I prefer not to have something or dislike something. But racism, I think, is a term that you can understand maybe better by saying prejudice and power. I think anybody can identify with racist beliefs, but to actually be a racist, I think you have to be in a position of power so that you can either change the behavior of somebody, or you can limit or restrict the behavior of someone. So I think that to be actually, to exhibit racism, you have to have that position of power or some form of being able to change the direction or take someone's belief or away from them.
When we talk about racism, it's not just against African Americans, it's racism in general against humans for something that we either don't like about them, or someone had mentioned because they're different from us. But when we talk about that difference, we're kind of all pretty much the same.
Exactly. We're all human. And I love that. I see that quite often. We belong to the human race. And I wish that more people would understand that there's very little other than pigmentation that separates us.
How do we work through that sense of racism that we all might have, or prejudice or bias? How do we begin to work through that and to begin to change what's going on, not just in ourselves, but all around us?
I think it's going to take one person, one at a time. Dialogue is so important to get to understand how you think and what's important to you and how you were raised, and then understanding how I was raised and what's important to me. And I think it has to be just a dialogue is probably the most important part. And I think taking dialogue, then we can do actions to support change. So I think it really starts with us. Even though you would think that it would start at the top, it's going to have to start with individuals that are just like you and I.
Would it be too simplistic to say that someone who has great power could really have great opportunity to dispel that sense of racism or prejudice among people?
I truly do believe a person in power can stand up against unlawful acts and talk about how wrong it is, and maybe to evoke understanding and awareness. I don't think that they themselves could be someone who can eliminate them, but coming out as a position or a person of power and speaking against the hate and the violence would at least begin a conversation.
And why are we racist against certain groups of people, whether it's Catholics or Jews or immigrants or blacks or Hispanics or Muslims. Why are we so fixated on that sense of division among those people?
Because we don't understand. We either choose not to understand, or different cultures and different ways of belief and activities, and how you are raised is different. And it just depends on wanting to understand a different culture. So I think racism or prejudice comes from fear a lot. So you don't understand who that person is.
Yeah. In our last few minutes, do you have an experience or a personal experience that you would share that would kind of typify this, or what you've learned to move beyond that, or what you have maybe taught someone else about that?
I think being involved in our local organization that kind of spurred just a couple of years ago, the Greater Youngstown Community Dialogue on Racism. I was really never that involved, but as we looked at situations of why Black infant mortality is so predominant in our community, and then we look at race and bias and just understanding, not that we're going to cure or resolve infant mortality through discussion, but maybe more understanding of why situations persist, and understanding the cultures and the background of individuals, that we begin to open up and start an understanding.
What would you like to share with the folks that are with us as we wind down in about a minute about racism and why it's so evil and so wrong?
It just perpetuates hate. And it's so easy just to get to understand who that individual is, to dwell in hate and the things that, being so angry towards another individual for not really understanding anything other than they're different from you is just wrong. It's just wrong. And I think that you should be able to identify that in yourself and then get to know that individual, and maybe you'll be surprised that you'll find out they're just like you.
Sure. Well, Leigh Greene, we thank you for being with us today and being part of our series, but also for highlighting and sharing your personal experience. We appreciate that very much.
Well, thank you for having me. I had a pleasure.
And thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Removing Barriers was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program host was Father Jim Korda.